Morning, everybody. Today I wanted to walk you through the BCH model that I was talking about previously for the argument FRQ, and I'm going to use the 2013 AP English Language FRQ. If you scroll down, I'll try to attach this, or you could just Google AP English Language 2013. Scroll down to question 3. It says, for centuries, prominent thinkers have pondered the relationship between ownership and the development of self-identity, ultimately asking the question, what does it mean to own something? Okay, I really like this one. I think it's good. We live in Orange County, and it's kind of a superficial culture, unfortunately, and the ownership of things is highly emphasized. Let's put it that way. So Plato argues that owning objects is detrimental to a person's character. Aristotle claims that ownership of tangible goods helps to develop moral character. 20th century philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre proposes that ownership extends beyond objects to include intangible things as well. In Sartre's view, becoming proficient in some skill and knowing something thoroughly means that we own it. Think about the differing views of ownership, then write an essay in which you explain your position on the relationship between ownership and sense of self. Use appropriate evidence from your reading experience or observations to support your argument. So, an important thing here is to identify the key instruction words. And when this was a paper copy, I would have the kids like, hey, underline the key instruction words, but you could sort of highlight them. So I did that here. I said position, or pause, on relationship between ownership and sense of self. It's funny because I teach my students to own the argument terms. That's how we start the year, and they have to memorize the terms and not just identify slippery slopes from like a multiple choice test, and those are easy, but to actually memorize it word for word so they know verbatim the logical fallacies and the types of supporter evidence and things like that. So hopefully at this point they've owned them and they can identify them in argument and then use different types of supporter evidence in their own argument. And then if you recall from my chicken foot, I had, let's see, actually if I could pause real quick, pull this up. If you recall from my chicken foot, I said you should, before you dive in, try to use BCH, a book, a current event or cultural example, or historical example. And I already made a critique of my culture where I live and how superficial it is at times. Before you just dive in and BS the essay like I did in high school, don't do that. Okay. So I've got 3 books. I've got To Kill a Mockingbird, if you could tell from these pictures. I've got the Buchanans from Gatsby, and I've got Frederick Douglass. Okay, so. And my chicken foot is going to be although plus concession plus position, and then I'm going to try to think of a concession and tie that to an example, and then a subclaim tied to an example, and this could be a potential paragraph, and then another subclaim tied to another strong example, and this could be a potential paragraph. So that's where I'm going with those 3. So I'm going to start with my concession. Although over-reliance on the ownership of tangible things can have a negative impact on who you are as a person, ownership of intangible things can have a great effect on your character. Okay, so that's kind of a simple, simplistic thesis, but it works because it demonstrates a nuance. And you just want to get the 1 point for the thesis, and then I would probably tack on my evidence as a sort of a preview for the reader. It's like, hey, I'm going to talk about Douglass, I'm going to talk about Gatsby, and I'm going to talk about To Kill a Mockingbird. Then I'm going to get into my body, and I'm going to start with the CNC, and I'm going to say, Frederick Douglass, if you go here, it says CNC, that's concede and then counter, or concede and crush is what I like to say. Frederick Douglass and the ownership of slaves, and how the slave owners not only were unethical and racist and cruel, but also they over-relied on the ownership of these slaves for their economy. And then I'm going to counter by saying, you know what, the intangible ownership to this whole story was that, you know, luckily, through fortuitous circumstances, Douglas made friends with some of the other kids, and he was able to learn to read and write from the slave owners' children, some of the white kids. And that he became like one of the greatest orators of his time and a leader in the abolitionist movement. The Buchanans are going to be my next evidence, and I'm going to talk about how they are sort of like the 1%ers in our society who think they can get away with murder, literally, as they do, because Daisy was the one who committed murder, or vehicular manslaughter if you want to get technical, and didn't even have the courage to show up for his funeral. Okay, and you can maybe tie those to the 1%ers like the Kardashians and the super rich like the Zuckerbergs, etc. And you could also concede that there are, you know, good people who are in that 1% category who do good, and you could maybe talk about the Bill and Susan Gates Foundation, or, you know, those 1%ers who've done philanthropic work. And then my last paragraph for the body, I'm going to talk about how Atticus owned the courtroom in To Kill a Mockingbird, okay? And he owned the law. It was an intangible thing, but it gave him the power to persuade, and it gave him the power to promote justice and racial equality. So I'm going to kind of come full circle with my race theme in this essay. So anyway, I'm just trying to brainstorm instead of BSing and talking, oh yeah, it's great that I own this, you know, Stairway to Heaven on my guitar or whatever. But I'm going to talk about some concrete things. And remember, my audience, they're AP English teachers, so they're going to eat up these things that are going to reference Gatsby or To Kill a Mockingbird. English teachers love To Kill a Mockingbird. Okay, and they're going to eat up this idea of Douglas owning the ability to read and write and become a great orator for the abolitionist movement. So then I'm going to come full circle and talk about how I'm going to sort of side with the Frenchman on this one, okay? But demonstrate to the AP reader that I've looked at the complexity of the issues, okay? And there's some great quotes here from 3 philosophers, and I'm going to try to synthesize all 3 of them into my thesis, my hook, and my conclusion using BCH. Don't BS.